even though you've been on before, way back in 2020,
Yes.
do you want to still give the listeners and viewers an introduction to yourself?
My name is Sarah Boon, and I'm now the author of a book called Young Autistic and ADHD. So again, at time of recording, it's going to be published in a few days, which is really exciting. But a little bit about myself as well is that I was late diagnosed autistic. I got my diagnosis back in 2019, but I would say from 2018 was probably when I started to question it. And then in 2020 is when I got my ADHD diagnosis. And I think it was literally only a few weeks before actually I spoke to you, Air. Because I remember it being really new. I think I only had it a few weeks at that point. And again, I've always known I'm dyslexic. I'm dyslexic as well, but that was the only thing that was picked up when I was younger. So I'm multiply neurodivergent, although I didn't have a concept of what it meant to be neurodivergent back then. It's only really as I've discovered my autism and ADHD in adulthood that I've learned about that and understand it properly.
Thank you very much. Since last did the interview, I said it was very early on in your ADHD diagnosis, and I remember, I think we were talking about the idea of self-diagnosis, even though at that point
Yes.
you got the diagnosis and the benefits of that. And I know that for the readers of your book, Young Autistic and ADHD, it's something that they yourselves might be self-diagnosed with, either autism and ADHD, and learning about that diagnosis. So what has been like since we last talked via Zoom and on the podcast? What has been a journey you've been through of learning more about your ADHD, learning a bit more about your autism?
Yeah, sure. I think in terms of that journey as well is I probably knew, I think last time I spoke, probably I knew a lot more about autism than I did at ADHD at that point as well, just because I feel like what I knew about ADHD is what kind of textbooks were saying, and not so much kind of like other people's experiences, like beyond my own. So I definitely feel since then, I feel like I'm always learning as well. Like I don't think there's like an end point into learning. I think there's always more to learn when it comes to autism and ADHD. But I think in terms of getting a better understanding of how it affects myself, also how it is for other people as well who aren't the same as me, I think that's also really important too, because we all have our kind of own experiences with it as well, and we all come from different backgrounds, which influences it. I know obviously you've talked about like how self-diagnosis as well is something that people do, and again that is something I absolutely support, because I understand there's so many barriers in terms of getting the diagnosis, and it's actually something I do go through in the book, because I feel like a lot of the time people kind of debate, should I get a diagnosis, shouldn't I? So there is actually one section where it talks about some of the pros and cons as well in terms of getting a diagnosis, so that if people are reading it and questioning it, hopefully that can just be like that starting point in terms of figuring out if it's right or not. But yeah, is to just to keep with that self-diagnosis, and them just knowing that is fine once they've done their research and they've looked into it as well. Getting diagnosed, it can be an expensive process. You can have to wait for a long time as well. There's many issues around that, as well as biases you have in the assessments. I think self-diagnosis is really important for some people, but at the same time, it's one of these things. I don't think diagnosis should be compulsory. Is getting a diagnosis going to be the right thing for me? Probably when I first came into this, because I didn't know any different, I was like, oh, you need to get diagnosed if you think you are. But I think I definitely have a bit more of a nuanced view on that now.
What has been your own like personal journey in terms of what are the things that since your diagnosis you have learned about yourself and started either to find answers to your own questions that you had before your diagnosis or at the point of getting a diagnosis, and what things have you been able to adapt, change because of learning and understanding more?
So I think one thing is I'm not as harsh as myself. I used to be really critical of things that, like mistakes that I'd made or other people would view as mistakes. Like, why can't I do things normally? I think definitely before I knew about my autism and ADHD, I was obsessing with this idea of have to be normal to be happy, where I feel like that is probably one of the biggest changes there's been, because it's actually, if I try and act and be normal, that's why my mental health wasn't great, or it does have an impact on my own mental health. So I think the biggest shift has been is not being harsh on myself for when, you know, things do happen because of my autism and ADHD. That is just how my brain works. It's what it is. It isn't like a personal fault or anything like that. So I think that's one thing that's really important. And again, I do think that's really helped my self-esteem, because that's, I'm not gonna lie, before diagnosis, I think that was a major issue that I wasn't really, I think it was just putting it to the back of my mind. I think I probably deep down knew it was there, but I didn't want to think about it. And I think as well, it's like adjusting what my expectations, because I felt like kind of with the people I grew up around, like everyone just followed like a really specific part, or a lot of people did. And it's actually, I need to go on my own path, and that's fine. And it's okay that I'm diverging from the normal here, because that normal is just it's not gonna help me. It's not gonna give me a good quality of life, despite what everyone's saying around me. So I think those are the huge things. Those are like the huge things in terms of the more practical levels. Again, I've learned little tricks, tips just to get through life that can make it easier. Again, it's just kind of trial and error of doing those things, finding out little things that can just make that life a bit easier as well when you're neurodivergent.
What are those tricks and the tips?
Yeah, what I've learned is that I really struggle sometimes to process like a lot of verbal information at once, or let's say someone's giving me like 10 instructions at once, but it's said out loud. I know that I'm not going to remember or retain much of what's said. So again, it's making sure it's written down in a way that's accessible to me. So that may be through a flow chart, depending what it is. It may be through bullet points, a variety of different things. So that would just be one example of that again I'd find really helpful. Also as well, I've definitely gotten the habit of having like reminders on my phone, and having like apps that will like literally ping information up so that I don't forget. And again, I can set it so it comes up as like a reminder like at a certain time. Like I wasn't doing this stuff before. It can really help with those day-to-day tasks that can be more difficult. Also, what I've learned is, again, I think most people listening will probably be aware of stimming. And stimming is something I've always done, but when I was younger, I think particularly in school, I learned to do it in ways where it couldn't be seen by other people, so it was like really subtle. But I think now it's with things like that, it's actually, it doesn't matter, not doesn't matter, but it's actually, I don't have to be as hidden about it. If I just need to fidget with a pen to concentrate, that's fine. It's not a big deal at the end of the world. I do think when you're adults, there's some things that school may seem to be a major problem, but actually it isn't as much once you're out in the real world. Thing is, I've just lost my train of thought there. I know that's my ADHD. Do you have that as well, where you'd be like halfway through making a point and then it just goes?
Well,
it doesn't come
even though like I haven't got a diagnosis of ADHD, which I kind of highly suspect that I probably have, but yeah, it does sometimes happen every now and again, because like it's like when you were said about the whole list of things, even with like when like even having one thing extra on a list, I totally forget about it. I do tend to sometimes forget things like that. I do relate in terms of that.
Yeah, definitely. And then it will come back to me as soon as I like leave a conversation or advise that person, and it's, oh wait, that's what was the point I was trying to make. I always hate when it's frustrating when it happens, but it is what it is.
It is. I was just saying then, you always stimmed. So what are the things that you have, how have you always stimmed? And in terms of, as I said, ADHD, and like you've been able to look at both your autism and ADHD a lot more over the last few years, and she talked, what are the things that you probably noticed that you masked, and what are the things that you noticed I've learned over the years that ADHD and autistic traits that you might have not known about, but you just happened to find out about because of learning about your own neurodivergent condition?
To be honest, there's so many, but I guess some of the things I can think off the top of my head is with sleeping as well. Like I have real difficulties trying to fall asleep because it just feels like my brain won't shut up. I've spoken to a lot of other neurodivergent people who are autistic, have ADHD or both, and they certainly, the people have similarities of that. Also, I'm quite sensory when it comes to things like food and texture and taste, all those kind of things. I did face a lot of stigma growing up for what I was eating, how I was eating. And I was really made to feel like that was a major problem and issue, but no one was thinking about, is there sensory things going on here or anything like that, which is what I really needed rather than the judgment I faced. So I think that was another huge thing in terms of how I socialize, or again, I find socializing quite draining, and I think a lot more so than most other people. So it's not like I don't like to socialize, it's just I have a low limit of what I can manage. I find most other people like to socialize more than me, so people would interpret that as I wasn't interested or I didn't like someone, but it wasn't that case at all. So I think things like that, and it just all makes so much more sense. It's like things kept going wrong, but you're never understanding why. But finding out about the autism and ADHD for myself just explained so much of that. And it was a huge relief. It's, there's a reason why. It's not just something unexplained going on. I would say relief was probably the biggest thing I felt, I think, once I realised, and then it was later confirmed. Why is life so difficult? And as I mentioned before, it's almost like that self-criticism that I had a lot of the time as well. Definitely had its impact too. So again, I think it does come back to that as well.
With the self-criticism and the negative thoughts around the neurodivergent behaviour, about why things happen so wrong, why you struggle with certain social interactions, remembering stuff, concentration, all that. Even though, as I say, it's neurodivergent conditions like autism and ADHD and mental health conditions, but it's learning about how from maybe prior to diagnosis to getting a diagnosis, how those feelings of depression, anxiety and challenges with your own mental health can intertwine with the neurodivergent experience. And it's like when you mentioned about the food sensitivities, which is really more talked at the moment, is about relates that food eating disorder that can be common in autistic people of AFID. There's a lot of complex sensory issues that aren't talked about that are related to being autistic and ADHD. I guess from doing your book and a lot of research relating to your own work, that you've been able to learn a lot more about these concepts and research. As you said, there's always a lot more for you to be learning about autism and ADHD, but it seems because there's a lot more research or interest from the neurodivergent community to explore these areas.
Definitely. Yeah, because I think these are huge things that can impact our quality of life. It's really important to understand these concepts and the differences we have, so then we've at least got a starting point in terms of figuring out what direction we want to go in. Or I feel like you almost don't even have the tools to work with in terms of living the life you want without that information. Even if I look back to my early adulthood where I didn't know I was autistic and ADHD, and I think this was a lot of the reason why I did write this specific book, young people who are autistic ADHDers or ADHD, is because there's so much that I look back now. Again, I'm 30 next year. I'm like, I wish I could go back in 10 years and just tell younger Sarah all of this, or this is what younger Sarah would have really benefited from knowing. As if I think about the life choices I made, or again, I'd be walking into situations, but because I didn't have that knowledge of my neurodivergence, I was almost doomed to fail. That was a motivation for writing the book. Was I feel in those years since I've learned, I was like, actually, there's so much younger Sarah could have known. I feel like there's so much I want to tell younger Sarah about 16 to 18, and then all the way up until around the point I got my diagnosis, because I think as well, because I didn't have that knowledge, obviously you do make big life choices, generally speaking, around those ages in your life. And I just think I probably went into so many different situations or things where I was doomed to fail, but because I didn't have that knowledge of my neurodivergence, I had no idea or indication that that was going to happen. I was just thinking, I just need to try something new and it'll be fine. But then I kept repeating that, and then I think that was part of when I realised was there's something going on. It would have been summer 2018. Because anxiety and depression had always been mentioned for me, but nothing else. And I think I realised there's something more significant or bigger going on. That's not just anxiety and depression, but I was like, I don't know what. And I think that was the path of beginning of realising I'm an autistic person, and then later I'm an ADHDer too. Obviously, I know autism and ADHD have set criteria in terms of how it's understood. There were certain parts of like autism that I didn't relate to or didn't quite fit me in terms of the stereotypes and what is on the criteria, but then a lot of it was very relevant to me. But the same with ADHD as well. And I think from talking to other autistic ADHDers, that's when I realised, I was like, actually, this completely makes sense as to why there's some things about autism that feel a little bit different to how it's understood. But then also I was debating, do I have ADHD? Am I ADHD or not? Like, I genuinely didn't. And when I spoke to autistic ADHDers, then I was like, that makes sense in terms of these things. Again, one example is the things like with routine. I wouldn't say I'm a very routine-driven autistic person, whereas I know some people are, and I do feel that's because of the ADHD. I see it like, I know I need routine to some extent to help me just get through day-to-day life, but I really hate sticking to like the same routine day in, day out. Like I need more variety, and that's where I know the ADHD is coming in. Sometimes it can feel like a battle in your mind, so then you literally just end up like doing nothing when you actually need to do things, because there's part of you that just wants to do things a certain way, but then that the ADHD is too boring, it's too mundane, and then that's where I think procrastination can become an issue as well. But then again, sometimes there isn't a clear line as to what is autism or what's ADHD. Sometimes it is it's interwoven with each other. It's a bit more, it's clearly something to do with being neurodivergent, but you can't necessarily, it doesn't necessarily always fit into a neat box of this is definitely autism and this is ADHD. And this is something that does come up in the book as well. Because I also interviewed some fellow autistic ADHDers again, and their insights are throughout the book. And again, some of them were saying similar things as well. And it's interesting because I think, again, there's a lot of research about just autism or just ADHD, but again, you don't see much of it together. I feel like it is just starting to be talked about more, even since 2020 when I last spoke to you, but it still feels like very early days in terms of what it's like for, I know it's being called like ADHD now. Yeah. I'm going to be really interested to see how that develops.
Yeah, it feels like the term ADHD is quite new in the last even couple of years, because I haven't really heard about it more than that. But I think it's because, I guess, a lot now post-pandemic, there's been a lot of people end up having the two diagnoses and actually talking about. And as it seems that from when you first got diagnosed with autism back in 2019, and we're starting to consider how you got, that you are autistic. If you can briefly say, what was it how you discovered like the label that matched yourself in terms of what was the moment where you kind of thought, yes, yeah, I'm actually autistic, and how did you kind of fall across the word and confidently kind of, this could be something I need to look into?
In terms of that process, it started in 2018, because I feel like there's a few different steps before I got to I'm 100% autistic. So again, I think it started summer 2018 where I knew there was something more significant for myself than anxiety and depression. I just didn't know what. And then the time I started questioning autism, it was around Christmas, probably shortly before Christmas 2018. I'd just been at something, like I was just done so much socializing in one day, and this random thought just popped into my brain being like, I swear only autistic people struggle this much with socializing. Then I just remember that night I got onto Google and just started Googling, am I autistic, autism? And a few things came up, but then again, I think you've got to remember a lot's kind of happened in terms of understanding autism, even from 2018 to now. Don't get me wrong, a lot of ableist stuff comes up when you type in autism to Google, but I do feel like more neurodiversity paradigm stuff is starting to come through, but there's still a way to go. None of it clicked with me, and I was like, maybe one or two things. I was like, I'm not really sure. And then I remember I just fell asleep at that point because this was quite late at night, but it was still going around my mind, and I was like, aren't I? So I'd just be occasionally Googling things, and then I was just like, maybe, I don't know. And then it would have been a few months after that I finally got the answer, and it was YouTube. So I can't remember what else I was watching on YouTube, but on the side, it's weird, it's almost like the algorithms was trying to tell me something before I realised. There's a video about autism in women and girls, and I was like, oh, I haven't heard anything about that. So I just clicked on it, And then I think it was about a half an hour video, and it literally just felt like someone was describing my life story. And then I was just like, oh my God, I was like, this is it. No, I'm definitely autistic after watching that video as well. And again, because so I think at that time it was very gender binary, as like only autistic women and girls can mask, but obviously autistic people of any gender can mask. But I think that's where the understanding was at the time. And it just, for myself, I was born female, I'm a cis woman. Again, it was almost like there was one love and neat box that I fitted into that was being talked about, even though not every autistic person who masks will fit in that box. I was so shocked that someone had described the thing, like how I've been experiencing the world, in such a specific and accurate way. And I was like, how? Because again, in terms of the way I felt and the way I thought about things, I felt like I was the only person who was like that. And then to hear someone talk about it, where it was just specifically how I thought and things and how my brain worked, I was just, it was a true, oh my God moment.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just remember I think I was just laying in bed thinking, oh, I wonder what this YouTube video about. No idea that literal YouTube video pretty much answered the questions I was looking for. I didn't think it would, to the amount it did. So, because I know there's a lot of talk about, obviously, and I know there's so much inaccurate information online about both autism, ADHD, and neurodivergent people in general. But in this case, I think this video, yeah, it really did confirm it to me. That's when I was like, well, I think I need to get a diagnosis. I just really went from there.
I think at the point of when 2018 and when you had a point of social burnout, why that if you can, whatever information of that you had of autism in your head, just clicked in and thinking, right, yeah, that clicks with whatever you thought of autism, and it's that really ideas of what you already had in your head that kind of matched up at that point, because I guess by that point it seems like you were in a space of social fatigue and some sort of burnout point where, as you said, that when you started researching, as you was referencing early on in the conversation, that some of the stuff that you were exposed to of the diagnosis language in 2018 to early on, and still to an extent now, doesn't reflect the broadness of the spectrum, I guess, plays a part in why you had a diagnosis later on in life, and why the people within your life, whether school teachers, your parents, might have been oblivious to it. Even though I think in the last stint of you said, I think members of your family are neurodivergent.
I think I'm the only one who's diagnosed, but I'm definitely not the only one in my family. Obviously, I won't say who or how they're neurodivergent, their privacy. But yeah, and it's interesting because even just if I look, because again, my grandpa, who's passed now, when in retirement, one thing he did is he did a lot of stuff looking into our family history. And so I've read about like even ancestors, and I've read some of the things that have been found, or I've managed to find some more stuff on Google from relatives of mine in Victorian times, and there's things there I read and I was like, there potentially were neurodivergent, like I could just tell that as well. And again, obviously, even some of my relatives who have passed, I think one person, he definitely was, again, he also had learning disabilities. And again, but this was back in the 1930s, so he was institutionalized sadly at a really young age and just wasn't part of the family since. So that would have been I think it's my mum's great uncle, it was, or uncle, I can't remember exactly. And again, he was probably autistic as well. But yeah, I'm definitely not the only one in my family. And I think going back historically, you can definitely see there was neurodivergence there as well.
Going back to the book, where did the idea of writing a book originate from?
Yeah, I knew I wanted to write, I always liked the idea of writing a book. So even before I knew about the autism and ADHD, it's something I never really seriously considered, but I was like, it's something I'd like to do one day. I was like, even if I don't publish, just to be able to write a book would be cool. And then I think around the time I started my diagnosis, obviously you're aware because you follow me on social media, I started tweeting about things and like my opinions and experiences as well on social media. And obviously quite a few people were interested, particularly on Twitter as well. And then I also started a blog. So again, I was writing about autism and ADHD. And again, I think that's when I was thinking, like, if I'm going to write a book, I was like, I feel I could potentially write a book in this. Or I think especially as I was learning more and more and I was understanding things better, I was like, and I think this is where kind of aim. And then I think as well, so it's already started from a tweet I did where I said, there's part of me that does want to write a book. I just tweeted it one day. And then someone tagged who worked at my publisher being like, oh, have you contacted this person? And it literally just started from there. I had about a few different ideas of potential things I wanted to write. So we had a conversation and kind of developed the idea. And then I really narrowed it down to what Young Autistic and ADHD is now. That was a thing where I felt I could write the most about, or I felt like I had enough insights to write a whole book about it. Probably about 6 months after we had that initial conversation is then when I got the offer from the publisher to write the book, which really just started tweeting about it and then developed into blog posts. And then, really developed into a whole book. I've got a post on my blog did my ADHD mask my autism and vice versa. And again, that's almost like the first time I started writing about autism and ADHD together. And I almost feel like that was the almost kind of starting point of what Young Autistic and ADHD is now. And this book wouldn't be here if I hadn't written that post originally. And I remember at the time, it was quite a popular post on my blog. And again, I just felt like I had more to say. And then also, I think in particular, during that time, obviously I was coming out of like those first few years of adulthood. And I think I was just starting to get to a point where I felt like I was starting to know who I am and feeling comfortable in who I am. And I was like, actually, there's so much I feel like I could tell specifically younger autistic ADHDers, because I think those years can be really difficult. I think especially when you normally when you're coming out of childhood and your teen years, like everything's really structured and then suddenly it's not. And that can be huge for a lot of autistic and ADHDers and autistic ADHDers as well. So I felt actually I've got a lot I can share about this. There's so much to say about it as well. So again, I think there was definitely gradual steps. It wasn't like I'm going to write this book suddenly out of nowhere. But when I first started tweeting a few things about it, I could have never anticipated that several years down the line, I would write a book and it would be published. That feels pretty incredible.
It does seem like a good point of what to write a book about, because as you described before your diagnosis, that with your own traits, you yourself, you was isolated, and even if you have a diagnosis, like I had a diagnosis in school, because it was that heavily masked, even if there was other people who were autistic and dyslexic in my class, it was like the level of mask and the anxiety I had. I never felt I could be as out and open about it. Those teen years, I feel like never really talked about having your diagnosis and not really visibly in terms of like how you present as autistic, not as visible, and if you get recognised as autistic by other people in some sort of way, if you get what I mean. It can be quite a challenging time between socialisation, things of levels of independence, and it's probably the biggest time of change you go through is from your teenage years to your adult years. And there's a lot going on in that time, so it's quite a challenge. So I guess it's that reassuring the anxieties of somebody like yourself, who the way you felt around your neurodivergent traits led to that depression and anxiety and feelings of isolation, and like starting the conversations that many of us which we kind of were able to have from in like secondary school throughout into our early adulthood.
Definitely. I think during that time, if I think back to my teen years, I'm not saying it's the case for everyone, but I think for a lot of autistic ADHDers, there certainly would have been challenges and things wouldn't have been easy. I think a lot of us quite often just need time to almost recover, especially if we face a lot of difficulties. during that time before you can even think about if you want to go to college or university, or even think about work, or where you're going to live, money things. Like, there's all these things that suddenly, when you become an adult, you've got to think about. But it's thinking about, how can I make this work for my neurodivergent self? And it's hard. And I don't think there should be any judgment for people for not following a typical path or like the expected path. I know I've said this before, but I think it's just so important. A lot of people I've heard reporting that they feel behind because of their autism and ADHD, because people would have moved out by a certain age, or they're married by a certain age, or they have a really successful career at a young age, like all this kind of stuff that is harder when you are autistic and ADHD, no doubt. I think what's really important to know is that I think quite often we see this stuff on social media, which again is only like the highlights of people's lives. That's one thing, but also as well that we're not less because we haven't hit a certain milestone by a certain point. And it may be a milestone we don't even want to hit. For example, I know I don't want to get married, or that's something I probably realised shortly before I discovered my autism ADHD. And I think my neurodivergence is part to do that. That's quite an individual thing for me. But I'm like, that's okay, that's fine. I never have to hit that milestone that society tells us we have to hit.
Yeah.
It's those things as well, is learning that some of these things that we're told are normal that we have to do, actually we don't. But we're pressured to do it. And that can be so hard to navigate as well, because it can depend on, we may have pressures from like family members or in cultures you may be expected to do certain things. So again, it can actually be really hard to also do like in practical terms as well. But I think the important message is that you'll know less of a person just because your autism and ADHD means you're not doing things that society is telling us we have to do or have to do by a certain point.
It's tough with writing a book. What was it like deciding on what are the key areas that you were going to write about in terms of the themes, the chapters, and certain things within a book?
What I was thinking about is, what are key things I needed to hear? What are the key things a lot of young neurodivergent people I interact with who are autistic ADHD is? What are they talking about in my conversations with them? And it was thinking, and I think that's really where I decided on the chapters. And the way the book's structured as well is that it's each chapter's a certain theme. So if I get the book out here, I can talk through each chapter. So the first chapter is just introducing autism and ADHD. And I specifically chose that as the first chapter because, again, there's still people receiving late diagnoses. So again, someone may be 18, 20, 21, reading this book and just realise, and only just finding out now that they're an autistic ADHD. It was just like that, almost like at basic level, what does this look like in everyday life? And as well, I haven't just written down the like diagnostic criteria, because that's quite technical knowledge. The diagnostic criteria only focuses on like the deficits and the things that they see as disordered. So again, I tried to provide a more like neutral view of autism and ADHD, but in more everyday language as well, so that it can just make it that bit easier to understand for people who are new to this. Obviously, there may be young autistic ADHDers reading this book who've known for a while, so that chapter may not be the main thing they get out of this. There's other things I talk about that will definitely be relevant. So the second chapter is focused on executive functioning. I don't know how familiar are people with that term, but it's essentially how our brains work and those processes in our brains in terms of understanding information and using information. That comes from psychology as a subject, and I did do psychology at university. I did use some of that knowledge, but again, I try and translate it into from like academic stuff into non-academic stuff, just so people can hopefully get a little bit better understanding of how autism and ADHD can influence how their brain does process information and understand things. So again, I do talk about things in there, not just the differences we have with us at executive functioning, but also things we can do that can help with it as well, and little tricks and tips that I found helpful, but also other people who I interviewed for the book found helpful as well. So it's just, this is how your brain works. If you have these difficulties, you can try these things to see if they help. So that's essentially the second chapter. And then the third chapter focuses more specifically on the specific things in terms of young adulthood and having to make those decisions. A lot about if you want to do more studying or not, For those people who do want to work or need to work, again, there's information about there in terms about going about the recruitment process. Do I disclose or not? Reasonable adjustments, interviews. And then in the fourth one, it's about relationships and social interaction. I think that's a huge part for autistic ADHDers. So we've got to talk through friendships, family life, but also romantic relationships for some of us that will start to happen at around this age, but also work colleagues as well. I don't think that's something that's often talked about. And then the fifth chapter is about emotional well-being and mental health. I talked about it earlier as well, but it is quite a key part of our lives. I know there is research out there that talks about mental health for autistic people and ADHDers and some of the additional challenges we can face there. So again, we talk about that there as well in terms of these are the things that can come up. So there's just there's better awareness and understanding, but also that people don't feel alone or bad for what they're going through or what they're experiencing as well. So again, that's really important, but also as well, I guess this is where it probably gets maybe a little bit more political in terms of, I know we talk a little bit about how quite often mental health treatments aren't very neurodivergent friendly, or they're very much designed for like neurotypical people in mind. We talk, again, I know one other person brought it up in the book who we interviewed, but we talk about how CBT quite often isn't accessible for autistic people. Oh, sorry, I was talking about how often I go on tangents. So just like then, my cat's making noise, I just went on a tangent about my cat. Mm-hmm. And if I'm being honest, I do this a little bit in the book as well. Like I'll talk about something, then I'll go down a different rabbit hole, and then I'm like, I even said right now back to this point. It's how my brain works, and I've written the book in that way. So it'd be interesting to see how people perceive that, or even if they relate to that as well, because it's perhaps not as such typical style of writing. But again, I wanted to write this kind of from an authentic neurodivergent perspective. So if we get back onto the chapters now, which is what we were actually talking about. So the sixth chapter is kind of identity and acceptance, because again, something that I don't think is always talked about, but it's really, I guess it comes back to that question of who am I as a person? How does my autism and ADHD influence that? But then we also talk about other things as well, in terms of how do we view ourselves in relation to disability. I definitely see myself as disabled because of my autism and ADHD, but I know that isn't necessarily an opinion that everyone shares. And we talk about how that can be an individual thing. But then as well, we do touch on intersectionality as well, in terms of how other parts of our identity form who we are and how we understand ourselves. Again, one of the people I interview talks about being queer and an autistic ADHD, another one talks about being Black and autistic ADHD and some of their experiences with that. I talk about being an autistic ADHD woman as well. So again, it's really understanding like the other things that can affect our identity as neurodivergent people as well. And then we finish off by talking about how acceptance can be a positive thing, but it can be really hard to get to a point where you're self-accepting. I think especially if we've had years of facing kind of criticism or discrimination and bullying for our differences as well. So we talk about getting to a place where we can be more self-accepting of who we are. And then we finish it up with the conclusion, which kind of just summarizes everything that's talked about in the book all in one. But those are the themes of the book and the different chapters. We do cover quite a wide variety of things, but yeah, I just really hopefully it can just be a start. I very much see it as almost like a starting point for people who are perhaps young autistic ADHDers and they're like, I don't know what's going on, I don't know what to do. It can be really stressful and really hard. And again, I want this, because again, I can't wave a magic wand and tell people like, this is exactly what you need to do. But I think what I offer with this book is these are things to consider if you're autistic ADHD, almost like that starting point as well. So then it can help people guide, okay, this is what I need, or this is what I want, or these are the things I need to think about to get to a better place within my life. It's very much, I see it as hopefully a starting point in terms of people being able to learn, but also figure out what's the right options and choices for them in terms of how they live their lives as they start adulthood.
It's been like doing all the different conversations and like that aspect of talking to people as part of the research for the book?
I found it really fascinating. I felt like I did learn so much from those conversations. I think particularly people who had different experiences of my own from autism and ADHD. And I think that was something really important to have in the book because, again, no one individual can represent everything to do with autism and ADHD. That'd be impossible. I spoke to 4 different people, and there is variety in all of our experiences, which is great. It would be impossible just between 5 of us to have every single point with autism and ADHD within the book. But I think what it does give is it gives a richness to it as well. And that there's something where most autistic ADHDers can pick up and they feel like they can gain something of value, or they can relate to something, or feel seen in some way with what some of the different individuals are saying as well. That's what I'm really hoping those interviews really do add to the book, is providing those perspectives and life experiences we all have. But the one thing we have in common is we're all autistic ADHDers.
With the book, you kind of added a great resource of information for your target audience in terms of making sure for young people or for parents or teachers that work with young people can actually understand the experiences of neurodivergent people, especially with reflecting the kind of the social model aspects, disability and the presentation beyond the diagnosis criteria and the bullet points, because when you do a lot of research online and research of the more academic documents or the documents you might find doesn't always visualize it for yourself of what can look like in day-to-day life. And for young people trying to understand how their autism works, because without explanation it's a hard thing to imagine what autism looks like. So it's good to get that explanation, especially from your experience of your psychology degree, which I think helps a lot with your own writing and adds some sense of authority and information of what to include and how to approach things than review, because of being neurodivergent yourself allows you to approach this from a neuro-inclusive angle.
Yeah, definitely. Because a lot of psychology hasn't been neuro-inclusive. There's the assumption of normal, and anything that doesn't fit into what psychology sees as normal is a problem. It isn't necessarily said in those terms, but that's very much the way it comes across. Although that there can be some interesting things you can learn from like psychology and psychological research. I think particularly when it comes to like neurodivergence, it's very much viewed in a pathologized way. Executive function, what I talk about when you read the academic studies, it focused on our challenges, so that is pathologized and talked about in a medical model way. The limitation of that is people think because we're autistic and ADHD we can only be that. That's what I guess is what psychology has perpetuated about neurodivergent people. Even if when you get past some of the ableist language you just focus on what they actually found, that there can be some interesting insights in there, but it's very much framed in a narrative that's negative. I would say that there are some researchers where it's starting to go into a more positive direction. I've supported some research in doing co-production in autism where it's trying to go into a more neuro-inclusive way. Last year I was one of the co-authors on a paper looking at autistic university students' mental health. I have been part of that research process. It's an interesting one, thinking about the future of the academic side, in what direction it's going to go. I want to make it very clear that this isn't an academic book, but I talk about those insights, things that I found interesting that I've learned from the academic work I've done in a way that is hopefully can be understandable to people who don't have an academic background, or again talking about it in more simplistic terms that most people will be able to understand. Because again, I know in the book a few times I say the professionals call this thing this, but this is what it actually means in everyday life. One example I've got in there where I start off saying professionals call this working memory, but what they're essentially talking about is your short-term memory. And then I talk about how that can be different for autistic ADHDers, and then some of the things that can, with some of the challenges that can come with that, can, some of the things that can help. I could honestly do a whole conversation about, in terms of like academia and autism, because there's a long history. I've done some blog posts about it on my blog as well. But this book is definitely not an academic one. It's really to support the understanding of young people.
Even those people who are within academic studying psychology or within the field of psychology, having books like this, people like yourself are like trusted sources within the neurodivergent community, have element of research and has kind of personal experience and has talked to a wide range of different neurodivergent voices for the book and just in general as you do on your social media with, and you quite actively engage within the community. So it is quite good for anyone who within academia to have an element of that personal note of what is to be autistic from that less more scientific angles to appreciate the spectrum, to not always looking in just language and actually looking at the people at who they are rather than just what's on paper, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, definitely. When it comes to like how academia is written, it definitely isn't accessible for a lot of people as well. I guess one thing that I'm glad in terms of why I've studied psychology is I felt it's really helped my ability to like really look at like autism research and like being able to understand like how it's gone wrong as well. Or again, just having some of that background knowledge can help me see it from other perspectives, as well as just looking at it as like an autistic person thinking, oh, this is just ableist rubbish, which to be honest, a lot of it can be. I feel like from having that background, I can also actually understand from a more technical perspective, or actually this isn't right, this is wrong as well, and really narrow it down. And the thing is, it's a whole culture, it's not necessary just for certain studies where it's gone wrong. Again, you can see in terms of the motivations for why people are studying it is wrong. This is something you should always look into, is who funds the studies, because Autism Speaks funds a lot of autism research. Obviously, I don't know people's knowledge who are listening to this podcast of Autism Speaks. They don't have a good history when it comes to the autistic community and by the autistic people and listening to them. And again, they've done a lot of ableist things as well. I know that there's an advert from the early 2000s where they were like comparing autism as worse than cancer and diabetes. It was just terrible. But I'm assuming you know about Autism Speaks.
You have dyslexia as well as autism and ADHD, and
yes,
that we've been able to look a lot of research and chunky rich text with for somebody who may think of dyslexia and ADHD. Sometimes people don't always think of the academic reading as the most accessible way of doing research. So what are the things that it's been like as a dyslexic ADHD in terms of academic reading and writing? What are the things that helped you along the way to make it work for you?
I will say I find it difficult, and I will always find it difficult. It's never easy, because again, it is almost things that I have disabilities with in terms of how that works. But there are, I would say, a huge thing is actually technology. I feel like how technology's come on has made a huge difference. Like, if I was back in the 1970s, I'm not sure I would have even done that educationally. So what I have on, I think it's built into most computers now, which is good, because before you had to buy separate software for it, but it's text to speech technology I find super helpful, so it'll read it out loud. And again, I find that if it's like long piece of text, I use that in terms of so I can listen to it rather than read it with my, as you typically would. That makes a big difference, but also for proofreading my own work, because again, that I think both of the dyslexia and ADHD together, that can be so hard, because as well the ADHD I find makes proofreading really hard, because again, I will only notice certain things but not others, and I find it hard in terms of sustaining that attention that you need to pick out like every I and T and dot and make sure it's all right. When the book was going through the editing process, the biggest thing was like all the technical stuff that I missed out on the proofreading. So again, obviously editing is really important for any book, but I think in particular, that's where I felt like my disabilities really showed themselves, because those are the things that changed like the most. Not too much else actually changed. It was mainly typos, grammar mistakes, all that type of thing. And again, I know that is because of my neurodivergence. And But also something that I find helpful as well is having a dictate function. So the technology isn't perfect, so I sometimes get frustrated with it, so then I do resort back to typing, but I'll turn the dictation on, I'll speak, and then it will type on the screen what I'm saying. So again, that can be helpful, but if it keeps mistyping words I've said, I actually find that annoying. So with technology, it's still got a way to go, but I think if it got to the point where it could pick up everything perfectly and it was smooth, then that would be amazing, but it's not there yet as well. Yeah, and again, I actually did write a blog. I know I talked about my blog a lot, but I did write a blog post about how I wrote a book while being neurodivergent, and I talk about these things and a few other things as well, in terms of like how I went around the accessibility of it, in terms of that as well, in terms of the things I used, what I did, all that type of thing. It's one of these things, I will say it's definitely harder than it would have been if I didn't have the difficulties I do have with, I wouldn't say autism was a barrier for writing the book, or didn't make it more difficult, but I think ADHD and dyslexia definitely did. Technology, I've talked about essentially disability aids for me in terms of navigating that. It's not perfect, and again, obviously editors were able to pick up those things and help me get through those points in terms of the editing, where even though I did proofread and do all those things, I still don't pick up everything. It's more difficult, but it's not impossible. I did end up pushing back the initial deadline for handing over the manuscript twice. That was partly just because of life happened, which meant it was slower to write the book, but also in terms of navigating some of those challenges I had along the way as well. Yeah. But I know I'm glad I've done it, even though at times it wasn't easy, it was stressful, but it's written, it's done, and yeah, in a few days' time from when this is being recorded, it's going to be out in the world. A few copies have made it out early, actually. I don't know if you saw on my social.
I did see on the Instagram page, you had noticed in one or two bookstores you've seen your book. How does it feel now, knowing the people are already getting the books and it's publishing week? How do you feel now that you've become a published author?
It feels incredible. It is like a real pinch me moment. I'm not, because in my mind I was just like, oh, I'm going to be an author one day, but no, I am an author now. That is an amazing feeling, and no one can take that from me at this point. It's one of these things where it's just like, when I saw my book on the shelves, I think at that point I mentally feel like I'm a published author. It's on the bookshelves. Again, I know a few early copies were sold at the Autism show. My publisher got in touch saying we managed to get a few early copies out to one of the autism shows, and they were able to sell a few copies then. So I was aware there were a select few people who got copies a few weeks ago. A few days ago they started appearing on bookshelves, which was crazy. And then I found out a bookshop that isn't too far from me had it on their shelves, or it's saying on their website. I was like, that can't be right. So I actually called the shop and they were like, yeah, it's here if you want to see it. And I was like, oh my god. I went, and yeah, and then I put that all on my social media. Mm-hmm. So I didn't know what bookshops would stock it. You can't guarantee that bookshops will. It's very much their decision, because that's how the publisher explained. So I didn't know if or what bookshops are going to have it. So the fact that one close to me does was like really exciting. That one that I was able to go to, I didn't have to like travel ages just to see my book in a shop. Yeah, that was incredible.
Have you managed to have any feedback from people who have started to read it, or what like things that people may have already said in terms of the quotes they may be putting on like the back of the book? What things people have been saying about it?
Yeah, so not yet. I haven't heard anything back. So I've had some people send me messages being like, oh, my pre-orders arrived. So some of the pre-orders have made it out early, some haven't. Yeah, because I've been having conversations with my family where some people have got it, but other family members haven't, and there's a bit of jealousy going on there. But I think it just depended where they ordered it from, seems to have affected if they've got it already now or not, and they were all ordered in different places. So again, those are things that are beyond my control. But no, I haven't had people's opinions, because again, I think they only started arriving like 2-3 days ago. Yeah. But yeah, I have had a few messages being like, look what arrived today, and it's the book, and it's, oh my god, I know it's out there now. But yeah, it'll be interesting. I'm sure that kind of once it's officially published, and again, it's more widely available, I'm sure it'll be more. I know loads of people have ordered it on certain websites, and those will arrive around publication date and things, and hopefully it'll be for sale in even more bookshops when it's published for properly as well. It just seems a few early copies have managed to get out there. I'm not complaining. I think that's really exciting. Yeah. So yeah, hopefully soon I will be getting that feedback in terms of people who've read the book, what they think, and those things. There is part of me that's as well, I think this is where rejection sensitivity can come in, which is quite common with ADHD, where I'm just like, oh, what if people hate it? But then I'm just like, as well, I know I can't please everyone.
Yeah.
And I know people pleasing, a lot of that came from being younger and not knowing I was neurodivergent and all that. That's a huge topic in itself. Go down a massive rabbit hole, but I won't for now.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an easy thing to go down a rabbit hole off, because yeah, it's something that can sometimes play on your mind a bit. Said anything like rejection sensitivity, it's like if you got a feeling within your head or any sort of imposter syndrome like feelings as well, it's just like something that it's hard to take off from your head, and it just can play on you. So I'll be making sure I get a copy of it, and I look forward to reading it then.
Thank you. Yeah. No, I'm really excited to see what people think, and yeah, just to see how people respond to it. I think it's going to be really interesting.
It seems from, as you was talking earlier, the time when you were like going to start writing it, you had a couple of different ideas, for books. So I guess maybe this might be the first of many, in terms of like releasing books.
I do have an idea for a second book. I won't say any more than that because there's nothing concrete around. There's an idea for a second. Again, it's hopefully one day it will become reality.
And just want to go back on something we said earlier, last few moments. It's like when you were saying about that ancestry and like the kind of history of autism in your family. I always find that kind of an interesting thing, because it's when, like in history, when you, like, as you said, a relative having a learning disability, and when you do hear of like ancestors or like having mental health conditions, because like I guess the lack of diagnosis and diagnosis criteria at times, especially where it was down to people of different genders, of the typical male laments out there, you do always wonder if that the mental health conditions that they might have been diagnosed with, or however they were treated, whether they could have been autistic, because their history of autism and divergency doesn't allow you to fully understand the history of it, if you get what I mean.
I think you come to a really good point there in terms of, I know historically there's been cases where people have been diagnosed with a mental health condition, but they didn't have that mental health condition at all, and actually autism was what they had. It was just completely misdiagnosed. So I think it's important to say, obviously, you can have autism and also mental health conditions at the same time. But yeah, I think there are certainly cases out there where it just gets completely misdiagnosed as something else. And then obviously that can have a huge impact in terms of people getting treatment, which either isn't doing anything for them or making things worse. It's definitely a big issue.
Because you referenced your blog early on, do you want to give like a website?
My blog is called autisticallysarah.com, and on there I do write things about autism and ADHD and neurodivergence in general. So again, it's a mix of different things. So some of it is just like personal insight, some of it is like critical of like autism research and what the government does, which isn't great for autistic people. And trust me, there's a lot of things. As you probably understand, I write other things in terms of different things I'm doing. So again, there's information on there in terms of like the blog post I mentioned about how I wrote a book while I was neurodivergent, and talk about some of the accessibility around that. Also as well, I know I talked about the academic paper I co-authored last year, like there's links to there on that. I also do some freelance work around advising to do with autism, ADHD and neurodiversity. Again, there's information about how you can get in touch if anyone would like me to do some freelance work for them in that area. So yeah, there's a few different things going on there. But if you generally want to keep up with my writing and other things I'm involved with to do with autism, ADHD and neurodiversity, then yeah, definitely check out autisticallysarah.com. So on social media, I'm at Sarah E. Boon, and Boon is B-O-O-N. I know people struggle with knowing how to spell that. I'll send you all the details, Aaron, so then you can put it in the show notes.
Great.
Also, what I'll do is I'll share a link with you, and on there it has a variety of different places you can buy the book. So again, it is available online at most of the big bookshops as well. I know people prefer to support independent bookshops, so you can always go in, ask if they have it, and if not, what you can do is just give the details of the book and then they can order it in for you. So that's another way you can get the book. The link, so on the link there it has where it's available in bookshops in different countries. So there's some UK places, some places in the US, and I believe one that's Australian as well. And I know it's available in a few other different countries as well. So again, I would just check your bookshop or where you normally buy your books to see if they've got it. If not, you can order, I know you can order it directly from my publisher's website, Jessica Kingsley Publishers, so it's just jkp.com. So if you go into there, type in Young Autistic ADHD, or just like search Sarah Boon, you can order directly from the publisher's website. As well, if you can't find it where you normally buy books. And again, it's available in 3 different formats. So it's paperback, ebook, and also audiobook as well.